Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for our first Fireside chat. I'm very excited to be joined by Zach from Levi's and Nishant Patel from Contentstack. I'll let them give formal introductions to their roles and what they're working on. We have a couple questions prepared for you guys today for interesting discussions. And if there are any other questions or thoughts or anything you'd love to hear about, just shoot it over to either through chat or to the Q&A, and we'll tag those. We've left about 5 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Nishant and Zach.
Thanks, Carl. So I'll go first. My name is Nishant Patel. I am the founder and CTO at Contentstack, and I have Zach Crittendon here with me. Zach, do you want to say a couple of things?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Zach Crittendon. I'm a senior development lead at Levi Strauss, and I'm working on our headless, re-implementation of our entire e-commerce website, and using Contentstack as our CMS. So I led all the sort of architecture and development of that project.
Awesome. Zach, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. And thanks for all the attendees for joining us as well. Zach, let's get right into it.
Sure.
So your current role at Levi's is pretty interesting. You said you handle pretty much all the stuff with the e-commerce. Can you talk a little bit about the journey that Levi's kind of went through from, the traditional architecture to the new architecture with the whole microservices world? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So Levi's, interestingly, about 8 years ago, had 2 people at the company working on e-commerce. The rest of everything was actually completely outsourced to an agency. So around 8 years ago, they realized that was, where retail and things were going was not a great strategic place to be as a company. So they've invested a lot into developing those capabilities. So I think we are currently on the 3rd sort of major iteration of that e-commerce platform. And the last one, which was completed about 3 years ago, basically was a very standard out-of-the-box implementation of Hybris, which, as you may or may not know, is sort of a traditional monolithic Java web application. That solved some problems, but created many others, as the monoliths tend to do. So about 2 years ago, sort of put a stake in the ground and said that we are, as a business, moving towards microservices. And on the front end, that meant a headless system. So we have been working sort of somewhat incrementally to implement this. So last year, we implemented Contentstack as the CMS just for our homepage, while everything else was still running on the old monolith of Hybris. And then we also implemented a small launch of just the sort of search and browse experience of our site, so no checkout experience for some of our smaller markets in Eastern Europe. And that we did in a fully headless architecture, using Vue.js as our front-end app, GraphQL as our sort of API gateway middle layer that the UI speaks to, and then Hybris services for commerce. We're using Manhattan OMS as our order management system, and then Contentstack for our CMS. So that was completed last fall, and then basically this year, launching in August, is now the sort of big bang replatforming of the entire thing for all of our countries in US, Canada, and Europe, for both the Levi's and Dockers site. That's going live in early August.
Thank you, Zach. So this is interesting. So you've started this journey a few years ago. What was sort of the main reason? I mean, what were like the problems that you faced that kind of got you and your team to go down this microservices world?
Yeah, I think obviously it's the hot buzzword, and it's sort of like, why wouldn't you do that at this point? But I think the reality is that there are challenges in doing it. So it's good to have a real reason to do it. I think what we realized as a business is that none of the monoliths, they all come with a lot of good capabilities out of the box, but none of them come with the best capabilities of their specific breed out of the box. And while all of them can be integrated with other systems, there's a very heavy bias towards doing everything within the monolith. And so by going with a headless approach, we're able to, we've actually spent less time and effort doing the front end development for this new side of our launch. And we've been able to do the entire thing in a framework of our choosing with methods and tooling of our choosing versus having to do it all the sort of hybris way. So I think from a development perspective, it gives a lot more flexibility and in pretty much every case, less effort. The other thing that I think is really important that a lot of the folks on the technology side are not as aware of is it also gives you a lot of flexibility in the tools that you use for your business users. So a lot of what we're doing with our site is technically possible to do in Hybris, but their authoring tools for CMS are extremely difficult to use, very cumbersome. And so from a dev implementation perspective, might be the same amount of effort, but from a business user sort of end value to our business users and eventually our external customers, being able to choose a platform like Contentstack for that is a really critical capability for us. And you really can't get that without going to sort of a microservices architecture.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, there's obviously, like you pointed out, there's a lot of benefits of the microservices architecture. And let's maybe talk even more about that a little bit, and then we'll go into the challenges of it as well. But sure. In terms of getting value from the microservices that you pick, right? And the topic of this sort of conversation was how do you get value from the microservices or the technology that you pick, right? What are your thoughts on that? Like in this microservices architecture, you have, let's say, whatever, you might have 10 or 15 or 20 different vendors and technologies that you kind of, put together. And how do you ensure that you get the value for each and every of those services that you pick?
Yeah, so one interesting thing at Levi's is our IT organization actually reports up to the CFO. So everything that we do is very carefully planned from a financials perspective. And in fact, any project that you work on in the inception phase, as well as throughout the project, has to go through checkpoints where we've clearly defined what that value is and how this project is going to deliver that. Essentially, it has to be we have to get more out of the project than we put into it for basically everything we do as an IT organization. And so what we were able to do for the content management system, as an example, was by reducing our reliance on a monolith, it gives us a huge amount of additional negotiation leverage with them as we look at how those contracts get renewed in the future. So that was a very huge benefit of going to a microservice. Basically, it dilutes the impact that any given system has on your overall architecture. And if there is a tool that you're using that either is not keeping up in the capabilities that you need or is priced higher than it is for the value that you're getting, it's actually feasible to consider switching out that tool versus an entire monolith where you need a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project to even consider doing that. So that was a huge part of our finance org, the value that we captured there. I think the other part is finding ways to work incrementally. So starting with something small and achievable and a reasonable budget that still delivers, net positive value. But can be done in a shorter 3-month, 4-month time span. And so that's what we did with our initial implementation, where we basically took the homepage capabilities and made that much easier for the business users to manage without trying to do the entire site in that one project. And then I think the last part that's kind of the flip side to that is to also make sure that is work that can carry forward. So the way we implemented that homepage, the front end code that we wrote was componentized so that it could run as part of the legacy web application, as well as be imported in as components to our new fully headless system. And then of course the content schema and all the Contentstack APIs were completely unchanged through that transition. So the amount of sort of throwaway work was probably less than 10% of the project, which gave us a huge leg up on the next phase of the project, doing the larger site implementation.
Yeah, so I think you nailed it there, right? With the microservices world versus kind of the suite. You have to spend quite a bit of money to acquire the suite, and it has, or at least they claim that they have, like 100 or 1,000 features, but they don't go deep enough. Mm-hmm. And then to get the value from that, it takes longer because you have to spend the time and effort to implement that whole thing, and you're limited to that sort of world. Versus in this microservices world, what you mentioned was first the tooling, like you can pick the best of breed tooling, and it keeps changing. I mean, the world is moving so fast, so there's so many new things coming out. Right now you're on Vue, tomorrow you might decide you might go somewhere else, and you completely have the capability now to do that. And then the other point you made was this small, achievable kind of project to start with. So you have the Hybris, which you've already invested in, but to go into this microservices architecture, you can go sort of baby steps, right? Like you can start with a small project, maybe the home page or maybe a couple of pages, introduce a few new technologies, and then as you get comfortable with that, you can kind of go down from there. And I like the other point that you mentioned, Zach, as well, where it helps you with the negotiations. It's helped us a lot. I mean, at Contentstack as well, we're a headless, API-driven SaaS platform, right? It's a multi-tenant SaaS platform, and under the hood, we have tons of different microservices, and we're constantly breaking things down into even further microservices. And so our dependency on one sort of technology it keeps reducing, right? And then we write our own abstractions as well. So like you said, you can kind of rip and replace some of these things if it doesn't give you the value. So that's pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, it's good for tech. It's all the, any architect would say that that's the way to do it, but finance really likes it too. So that's when you can have both of those working hand in hand, it's a great opportunity.
For sure. I think so. What about sort of the business challenges, right? Like the procurement team before had one vendor or a few vendors to deal with. Like in this microservices world, that thing just explodes, right? So how is Levi handling that from a business perspective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Our sourcing team within our finance organization is very progressive in that regard. They don't seem to have an issue with having lots of vendors, and mostly it does come to the size of the contract that it is and how it kind of fits into the business. So kind of working, they were great partners through our whole process in doing our RFP and selecting from the different technologies, as well as sort of inking the contract when we went with Contentstack. So yeah, I guess I'm now that you asked that, I realize I think I really took them for granted through the whole process, because they were actually great partners through that, and they seem to actually have a bias away from really big monoliths and massive contracts. I think because from their perspective, it gives them a lot more leverage in the negotiation process, versus having a huge part of our critical business running on something where that vendor knows that there's not a lot of room to negotiate, because even to think about moving away would be a $10 million or $20 million project. So I think that they've actually really encouraged that move for us as well.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. I think from the technology side, it's exciting to go sort of to the microservices world, but the business also has to be very supportive in that sense, right? Because I see some of our customers struggling with that, because they're so used to just dealing with like a limited number of vendors, and they sign those huge contracts. but this new world it's a lot different, right? You get a lot of benefits from just moving fast in this new world. So Zach, can you talk about a few of the challenges that this new world kind of brings on?
Yeah, I think it's, I would say it's sort of, how do you boil the ocean one tea kettle at a time? So there's a lot of work to do to completely re-implement a website, and finding ways to break that down into both sort of initial proof of concept things as well as the entire project plan has been sort of an ongoing challenge. I think it's also sort of the paradox of choice, where a monolith, you don't really have to think very hard about how you're going to solve a given problem, because there's almost always a best way to do it within that they sort of give you the architecture out of the box, which can be, I think in most cases is bad, but can be good if you don't want to think very hard about it. So I think being very proactive within our developer community, as well as with our business users and product managers, to really understand, particularly as we're integrating across systems. So our product content, how do we enrich that with marketing content that comes from our product content comes from a master data management system that's tied into everything from like UPC codes and all sorts of other stuff like that but then, from a marketing perspective, it's what's a cool video or, or, the latest images from a photo shoot or something like that. So figuring out how those systems can work together in the right way is also an ongoing challenge. And for that, it's really critical to continually engage with and get feedback from the users, so we can really understand what it is that actually matters to them and advise, take that feedback, but also advise them on sort of what's easy and what's hard. So they're sort of making informed decisions on their requirements.
Okay. Yeah, this is one thing that you said, paradox of choice, is interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think particularly as we embarked on the sort of microservices approach, we have done it in a fairly decentralized way. So we actually do have some teams using Google and Firebase. We have some teams using AWS, some using Azure, and I think when we're starting out, it's actually good to try a number of things and get experience in a lot of different areas, but then gradually sort of herding the teams towards, when there isn't a huge difference between technologies, things being more similar rather than more different, can have some value in terms of, can have value in terms of cost. That's the flip side of the negotiating power, is that the more you do with a given technology, often you do get some discounts there as well. Right. So trying to use as much that's the same while doing it in a cloud agnostic way, so we're not locked in, has definitely been an ongoing challenge for us. But I don't know. I would say that it's since I was relatively new to the Hybris architecture, there's choice there, but it's taken me less time to figure out the best way to do something in AWS than it would have taken me to figure out how to do it in Hybris. So I think it's, I guess it's mostly if you are going to think, if you want something that's really off the shelf, then the suites are great. But if you have any particular needs, or your needs don't exactly line up with what the monolith does, then you're going to have the paradox of choice. And from there, I think it is I guess a process of, I think in that book, they said basically you want to narrow the field down. You don't want to consider everything. You should quickly cut options to get it down to a more reasonable set of choices. And then within there, kind of dig in and try to make the best choice. Nice.
Interesting. I deal with, even at Contentstack, we deal with this all the time. Because we're in this sort of microservices world, there's unlimited number of choices. But I like that, you kind of quickly narrow down and go with like a stack that would kind of make sense. And then
I think the word that that book used was satisficing versus optimizing. And so if you can get within 80 or 90% of an optimal solution in a few days, that's much better than getting 95% to an optimal solution in 6 months with a bunch of rework and things like that. So I think that's been a big part of our process as well. And I think that's also part of the value of starting with a smaller project. There are things we learned in how we built out the homepage, for example, that directly influenced how we've refactored that for this bigger relaunch. I think that is ultimately delivering a much better experience for our external customers and a much easier to use set of tools for our business users.
Awesome. I think we have 5 more minutes, and there are a few questions. Zach, can you talk a little bit about your current stack that you have to run the e-commerce website?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, do you mind? Can I share my screen?
Sure.
Let me try to do this. All right. So unfortunately, I was going to demo some stuff on our site that I thought was pretty cool. As these things go, it was working fine this morning, but about 20 minutes ago, stopped working as it's in development. So I have screenshots. But to specifically answer this question about the stack, this is the overly detailed but architecture diagram I had at my fingertips. So I will try to talk through this at the highest level possible, focusing on the biggest boxes. So our front end stack is Vue. So it's a Vue 2.7 or whatever the latest version of 2 is. Pretty standard Vue CLI workflow there with Webpack compiled down to a static single page app. We are not actually running it we're not doing any sort of pre-rendering and hydration. We're running it totally headlessly. That was a concern initially, but we've been going that route because Google seems to actually be doing just fine indexing that. So we haven't seen any SEO issues for that. We are using GraphQL as our sort of API gateway layer to connect to all of our various services. That is, interestingly, all passing through Akamai, which is our previous sort of caching layer in our monolith, which has come forward into our headless architecture, both as a WAF protection for like DDoS and things like that, as well as caching. All of our services then are going through Mule as our sort of API orchestration layer. Several of these are pass-throughs at the moment, but this was an important part of the architecture sort of for the longer term, where Contentstack is connecting to our customer-facing mobile app, the future where Contentstack is driving some of our in-store apps that our sales associates use in our retail locations, et cetera. So we wanted to make sure we had this all sort of centrally located in a way that was easy to orchestrate. And then, as I mentioned, Hybris is our e-commerce layer. These red boxes are the pieces that are going away once this new project launches. We're essentially just using it as our I guess, cart and product catalog services. And then we are using Manhattan order management system as our, to manage all of our orders. And then there's a bunch of other systems that, as a front-end person, I don't really deal with very much, that are related to all of our sort of order fulfillment and inventory management.
This is, Zach, this is pretty neat. I mean, you kind of started out with Hybris, and then it looks like and then Akamai was sitting on top of it. And kind of now you're decoupling whatever you could and bringing other services and kind of putting it all together, right?
Yeah, actually, that is a great point. If we went back, I think our Hybris does have some order management, very rudimentary order management capabilities. So if we go back in time, like 4 years, it was basically Hybris, Akamai, and then I believe some of these systems for integrating with our fulfillment centers. So all of these other systems have sort of gotten attached on over time as we've moved more and more towards more and more towards microservices. And in fact, Hybris, we're using Salsify as a product information management system, which currently is just feeding data into Hybris. But in the future, we're actually planning to actually use Salsify as our product catalog sort of system of record, and Hybris will be relegated even a further step down to only managing essentially our cart services. And if we decide something else could do a better job of that, we're now in a place where it'd be much easier to replace Hybris.
Awesome. I think there's one question in terms of the learning curve. What I see from this architecture is there's this GraphQL endpoint as well as MuleSoft, kind of being the gateway for APIs and being the front end, right? And to me, it seems like you can rip and replace other things in the back without a lot of your user experience changing much. So in terms of the learning curve, and then also getting like your development team to shift their mindset into this new mindset, right? What are the challenges, and how would you suggest someone can go or start going down this path? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it takes a village. You need to have multiple people working on it who have that sort of microservices mindset. The flip side of that, I would say, is that as we've worked with Contentstack, the schema of the content and how that comes through in JSON is, as we've built it out in Contentstack, what comes through to the front end is very, very close to what sort of the ideal state of that content structure would be. So in many cases, we haven't even needed to abstract it very much. I think for really the only exception is there are a few instances where a thing comes through as an array versus a single object, which is very easy to deal with. And so I think, again, if you can kind of sort of pick, I think probably the most important thing is figuring out in the long term what the different roles and responsibilities you want to have. And that's both in terms of how things are presented externally to the world, as well as internally. The business users who are managing Contentstack are totally different people than the people who are managing the product content in the product catalog. And so that helps. You could, in theory, use Salsify as a CMS for marketing content. You could, in theory, use Contentstack as a PIM, but knowing that those two roles are very different in the type of content they have, it's very easy to pick a solution there that's better for each of those. So I would say probably it's starting with the end in mind of what those different roles would be across systems, and then sort of one by one picking the thing that has the greatest value to the business with the least investment for technology, and finding a way to work that into the existing stack, but also can be implemented in a way that would work as part of a future architecture that is more headless. And that's exactly what we did when we brought in the Manhattan order management system, how we did Contentstack, and Salsify as well. I think that's our next big project of making things headless, is to turn that into its own service.
I think you make some really interesting points here. Like Contentstack could be a PIM, or Salsify could be a CMS, right? And I feel like you could get that with pretty much any technology nowadays out there with API-based technologies. But the point is, to maximize value, I guess Contentstack does three things. They do three things well, and just kind of focusing on that. And how is Contentstack adding value to the audience that you're trying to create the solution for, right?
Exactly. And that's Hybris could do all of these things as well, but it's not very good at that. Mm-hmm. And so I think the same thing with Contentstack versus Salsify versus whatever else you might use. It is really understanding on both the input and the output side of it, what's important. And actually, the other thing I wanted to show, one of the things I'm most excited about, since I've been working at Levi's the last 3 years, this whole concept of content and commerce sort of, we're a huge brand. Most of our sales still come through wholesale channels, whether it's like Macy's or Walmart or Amazon, but we are also selling direct to our customers. And so we need to have this dual purpose of serving the brand, but also selling things. And this, with Contentstack, all the products you're seeing here are coming through Hybris via Salsify. But, and then this title here, Women's Plus Size Jeans, is the name of this category in that product taxonomy. But then this block of content here is actually coming out of Contentstack. And then this content comes out of Contentstack. This video is coming out of Contentstack. And this content here, and in fact, this content here is, because of how we've architected it, is actually the same content we have on our homepage, exact same piece of content showing up in two places. And so, you know, in theory, you could do this in something like Hybris, but by having these separate services, you know, it's really just, I would say it took twice as much time to really iron out the requirements with the business for this as it took to actually implement this merging together of content and commerce, which is something our marketing team is ecstatic about, and pretty excited to have this going live in just a few short weeks.
Nice. No, this is awesome, Zach. Thank you.
Sure.
I think we're a little over our time. We'll take one last question that came in terms of translations. Like, how are you? And Levi's is all over the world. So how does like translations look for you today? Yeah,
that's a great question. So Levi's has the global model has sort of layers of control. So our Asia Pacific markets are fairly decentralized from the core Americas and Europe operations at this point. So none of these sites are actually going to be showing up in Australia or China or anything like that. However, that's because of how well this has been working for us. It's likely in the next few years that will come under one umbrella. But for the moment, it's just US and Europe. So we are in basically all of Europe from trying to think of the total number of countries. It's like 60 plus countries, and we localize into 9 languages. So that the localization features of Contentstack have been extremely helpful in that regard, basically having the different languages built in and created off of a master language. We have also worked with TransPerfect on an integration there, which frankly was 95% work on TransPerfect side, 5% on our side. And it's pretty simple. We actually have a workflow step in Contentstack where we set something as ready for translations. TransPerfect is pinging the content management API, polling it every once in a while to see what is ready for translation. When it finds something, it pulls that content out of Contentstack, marks the status in Contentstack as in translation. That workflow happens on their side, which can take a day or a week, depending on what the content is and how much of it there is, et cetera. And when it's done, they push it back into the correct localized slots within Contentstack and mark the status as translation complete. So it's a fairly seamless integration, works pretty seamlessly with Contentstack. We still have the ability to manually do translations and things like that if we need to, but it takes a lot of the effort out of the sort of data entry of having to export or import or manually enter that content. And that's been working really well for us.
Awesome. Zach, one last question to close out. What are the main factors for you to decide on Contentstack?
That's a good question. We had a extremely detailed, like 273 point checklist in our RFP process. The big things were that it was headless or could operate headless in a headless fashion. Because many of the monoliths out there, we did consider Adobe Experience Manager and Acquia Drupal and some other of the more traditional CMSs. But being able to operate headlessly was obviously one of the top criteria. I'd say the second most critical one was the ease of use of the authoring tools for our business users. That was an area where we didn't want to have to do a bunch of custom development to build those tools. And so Contentstack has great tools, pretty easy to use, and have the right balance of expressive in that the business users can use them to do what they want, but not overly complex. So the things that go wrong are kept to a minimum. I think, yeah, those are really the big ones. And a lot of the features that Contentstack has around localization and then content types like modular blocks and references were a huge part in kind of pushing them to the top of the list.
Awesome. Zach, I think we're way over our time here, but I appreciate all the answers that you gave us, and hopefully it helped the attendees here on this session as well. One thing I would like to announce is today we announced Mock Alliance, which essentially is microservices, API, cloud, and headless technologies, and it's an alliance of different technologies that kind of help help with the headless sort of technologies and the cloud technologies, right? So there's Contentstack's in there, commerce tools, and various others. So if people want to look into that, you can go to mockalliance.org. I think with this, we will close out the webinar. Zach, always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks.
And thank you for doing this. Thanks everyone for attending as well.
All right.
Yeah,
great. Thank
you, Nishant and Zach. We'll be posting this to our YouTube channel in a couple of days probably. And we're in the process of finalizing our next speaker for the Fireside Chat series. So we'll reach out for the next one probably in about a few weeks. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.